Good evening. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences and the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies, I welcome you to this fourth virtual conversation on emerging national security threat. My name is Mohsen Milani, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies. Before I introduce our distinguished experts tonight, let me say a few words about our next program and the nature of tonight's program. Our next event, please mark your calendar, is for Monday, November 16th at 7 p.m. I'm going to have an hour-long conversation with Admiral James Stavridis, who was, until a few years ago, Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He is a retired four-star general, admiral in the U.S. Navy. He led the NATO alliance in global operations from 2009 to 2013 as a Supreme Allied Commander with responsibility for Afghanistan, Libya, the Balkans, Syria, and cybersecurity. He is now the Chief International Security Analyst for NBC News. If you're interested in joining us, or if you're interested in joining any other programs our center offer, please go to the chat room, include your email, send it to us, and we'll put you in our listserv. Tonight's program is about American challenges in three important countries in the Middle East. Three countries where America has important national interests: in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon. And we have three fantastic, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, three fantastic experts and three great friends. I know them all. We have been to many conferences together. And by the way, the three of them have been to USF physically, not virtually, physically. So I welcome them all. We have Dr. Slim, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues Program at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. She is a former Vice President of International Institute for Sustained Dialogue, and she has been a Senior Program Advisor at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. She also has worked on the UN-mediated negotiations in Yemen and as a consultant with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Yemen. Our next speaker is Joshua Landis, who is the Sandra McKee Chair of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma, and he directs Center for Middle East Studies and the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies. That center is a fantastic center, and I'm pretty sure that Dr. Joshua Landis is going to make the center even better. He writes and manages SyriaComment.com, a daily newsletter for Syrian politics that attracts 50,000 page reads a month. And finally, last but not the least, my good friend, Dr. Abbas Kadhim, who leads the Atlantic Council Iraq Initiative in Washington, D.C. He is the author of a fantastic book on reclaiming Iraq, the 1920 revolution, and the founding of modern state. He has taught at naval postgraduate schools in Monterey, California, and at Stanford University. He has a PhD from the University of California in Berkeley. So I would like to welcome the three of you to the University of South Florida's Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Milani.
The format of the program is that we're going to have 2 rounds of questions for each of our speakers. I have asked them to spend about 5 minutes for each question, and then we are going to finish our questions and then the question and answer session that follows my questions to the three distinguished speakers. And I want to assure all of you, do not get nervous. By 8:30, the program is going to end, so we can all go and watch the second presidential debate. So let me start to ask my first question from Dr. Islam. You're an expert on Lebanon. And a few weeks ago, there was a huge explosion in Lebanon. So I have a twofold questions. Number one, do we know now who was behind that explosion? And number two, please tell us the kind of predicament, dilemma, Lebanon as a society is facing. Is that accurate to say that Lebanon is going through a major crisis now? Please spend about 5 minutes to answer those two questions.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Milani, for the invitation. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to me to share this virtual panel with my friends, Dr. Kadhim and Dr. Landis, and with you as well. So, answering your first question, the blast happened on August 4th. A committee was formed by the president of Lebanon and promised results within 5 days of the blast. Today is October 22, and we don't have yet reports of that committee. It is a committee that was formed by, as I said, by the president, involving the Lebanese army. So they are leading the investigation. They got assistance from the FBI, from the French services, security services in the investigation. We don't know what are the results. We don't know what caused the blast, and we don't know who is behind it. Definitely it's neglect, but there are many theories about some bomb that caused it or some attack from the air. It's all theories that have not been proven. They are out there, but it's not proven. And as I said, there is no official story. There is no official report of what happened from the Lebanese government or from any other source. The second question, which is how bad is the situation in Lebanon? So let me share with you and the audience just quickly some numbers. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, issued a report on Monday. They are expecting a 25% economic contraction in Lebanon by the end of this year. This amount is equal to that experienced by the United States during the 5 years of the Great Depression. This translates into a collapse of the purchasing power of the economy by 2/3. In August, inflation rate this August was at 120%. It's forecast to go as high as 145% by the end of this year. The banking sector has collapsed. Banks have imposed capital control. So if you have money in the bank, you cannot access most of it. There are limits that different banks have imposed on their depositors that differs from one bank to another. That started at $1,000 at the beginning of the crisis early this year, and now it is maybe around $100 or $50 a week that you can withdraw. People's savings are frozen, and as I said, inaccessible. There has been a de facto devaluation of the Lebanese lira by 85%. Unemployment is at 50%. There are widespread business closures, especially small businesses. And according to the recent estimates by the World Bank, poverty is expected to rise to 50% by the end of this year. Some economists are predicting it to go as high as 70%. So 70% by the end of this year of the Lebanese population will be under the line of poverty. You have close to 2 million people who don't have money to purchase basic stuff. We are not talking about meat and chicken and eggs, basic stuff, rice, sugar, flour, cooking oil. And so, and when you talk with economists, and I'm not an economist, there is no pathway anymore to recovery. Today, this morning, we were having a conversation with economists. He said Lebanon ran out of time 18 months ago. Right now, the only scenario that Lebanon is looking at is a Venezuela, Zimbabwe-like scenario, where you have a delegitimized elite that's hanging onto power with a population that is getting increasingly impoverished, reaching starvation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It seems to me that the situation in Lebanon is almost as bad as the situation in Iran. Now let's move from Lebanon to its neighbor, to Syria. Joshua, I have a simple question for you. A few years ago, I remember the slogan in Washington, the motto in Washington was that Assad must go. I recall reading this line from so many so-called experts that Bashar al-Assad is a dead man walking. And now we know that Assad has consolidated, at least some people believe he has consolidated, and has somehow managed to not lose the civil war. So the question I have for you, if you look back at the civil war and evaluate, assess the situation there, what do you think was the reason why Assad survived and his enemies were defeated, and many experts in Washington again made wrong prophecies about a Middle Eastern country?
Well, I would say that there are three main reasons. And starting with the first one is that very quickly, the uprising in Syria, where everybody wanted change, there was no doubt about that. And even the Alawites who are close to the president were fed up with the stasis and the corruption and so forth. The regime is extremely narrow, and there's only a handful of people who really counted. But as soon as conflict broke out, there were many different agendas that were at play. The United States, I think, made a mistake, along with many others, believing that this was a democracy, a movement for democracy. And of course, there was an important elite that was pushing very hard for some kind of democratic opening. But there were many others. There were many other currents that had broken out. And Syria had no politics for almost 50 years. And this was one of the reasons that Syria always punched above its weight in the region, was because Assad sat on all of this very disparate political community. And it was very hard to manipulate the country internally. And Assad was a very good at manipulating others. He could divide the Lebanese and rule. And he was doing the same thing in Iraq. Once Iraq imploded, once America invaded, he was playing, he helped send in jihadists at one moment, and then he would help the Shiites at another moment. So he manipulated the region, and this allowed him to survive. With the uprising, this collapsed. But once it turned into a bloody civil war, the various factions really became sectarianized. And people began to worry about their own community. The Alawites, the Christians, the Druze, the minority communities worried that they would be ethnically cleansed or killed in large numbers. And that kept them very loyal to the regime. And they fought desperately for 10 years. The opposition, which was made up largely of Sunnis after the first year, never united. And that was their biggest failing. The other failing was that they became increasingly dominated by Islamic extremists. And, even somebody like President Biden, for example, in 2015 at a lecture at Harvard, I believe it was 15, he said, there's no such thing as a moderate middle in Syria. Washington's partners have made the situation worse, he said. They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do, Biden asked during his speech? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight Assad, except that the people who were being supplied, they were al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, extremist elements of jihadis who were coming from all parts of the world. This is Biden speaking in 2015. And so clearly what happened there is that the United States got spooked. It frightened itself with this opposition that increasingly became, as the liberals got pushed out of this of the spectrum, the jihadists became dominant. And they spooked America. America turned on them and went for the Kurds and helped to spark Kurdish nationalism, to get the Kurds to fight ISIS, one of the elements of the opposition, and destroy it. And that's where we are today. And ever since then, the US, the West, turned against the opposition and abandoned them. And so Assad was able to survive for that, and because he had better friends in Russia and Iran. And the West abandoned the Syrian opposition. And that's where we are today, with a Syria that's broken down. If Rwanda could bring tears to your eyes about Lebanon, I mean, Syria is just a disaster. And the banking collapse in Lebanon had extraordinarily bad effect on Syria, because most Syrians who had any money left kept it in dollar accounts in Lebanon. And that's all evaporated. Over $120 billion in Lebanese accounts, of which we believe around 30% were from Syrians, are gone. And so that's left Syrians in a terribly devastated state.
Excellent, excellent answer. Now, Dr. Kadhim, if we go back to American invasion of Iraq and look back at what America wanted to achieve in Iraq, now, many years later, when we look back at what America wanted in Iraq and what has actually happened in Iraq, which I think you would agree with me is not what the US had envisioned. So if you go back to the time of invasion, the first year or two after the invasion, what do you think was the biggest mistake the United States made about Iraq that, in your judgment, has contributed to Iraq moving in a direction that was not desired by Washington?
Well, thank you, Mohsen, and I echo and telling you how privileged I am being with this distinguished panel. Thank you for organizing this event. It is hard to tell what the U.S. vision was to be able to say, was it accomplished or not? I mean, what could argue that there were many visions or there was no vision at all? I think the one thing that we can all agree on is that the United States wanted to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. That's, clear. And that was a good goal, to be honest with you. I'm, as a person that tried to do it in 1991 and failed, I could not argue against that proposal. But after that, there was no vision. There was no, the purposes kept changing, from weapons of mass destruction to creating a democratic Iraq to so many things, friendly Iraq, not threat to its neighbors. So it kept changing. But I think the greatest mistake that the U.S. made in Iraq is that they did not do their homework. And I wrote the book on the British experiment in Iraq in 1920, well, from 1914 to 1932, but at least the around that formation time of the state in 1920 and 1921. The British before that, they had decades of studying the country, had real experts of Iraq who either went as advisors or some of them even were as administrators. If you look at the profiles of the people who made the decisions and who held the positions in the US administration of Iraq, there was none of them that could be called an Iraq expert. That was a problem. So they were taken for a ride by so many people in Iraq, either opposition that they trusted or people who are inside Iraq. And they kept making decisions that were completely in the dark. That was, I think, the greatest mistake. The other mistake was that they did not take charge of the process itself, unlike what happened the U.S. has no history of changing regimes and building nations and doing that. It wasn't an empire in that kind of way. There are They only had two examples that they always bragged about: Germany and Japan. And and Germany and Japan were completely different. The time was different. The context was different. The geography, everything. So I think that was a problem. But the U.S. did not take charge. Did not. I mean, even one of the basics. If you look at the history of colonialism, all of the colonial powers, before they left the countries that they colonized, they left behind governments that look like theirs. The French left republics, the British left monarchies. The Americans, a presidential system, went there. The people who were involved in Iraq hardly understood the American system. Many of them were too young even to understand that. Went and tried to coach the Iraqis on how to create a parliamentary system. That was, completely out of the understanding and scope of vision for U.S. Administrators. So it was really a chaos that was there. A situation that went out of control, and the U.S. was paralyzed. Also, I think, and if you recall back, and I'm sure you recall, all of the people on this panel are Iraq experts of some sort here, so I'm lucky. We all remember the talk about the U.S. assumptions going into the war, that Iraqis would receive Americans by roses and with roses, and that it would be a cakewalk. And the Iraqis hated Saddam Hussein so badly that they would embrace any attempt to change. And there was a complete ignoring of the past history of the United States with Iraq. They ignored the 1991 never happened, and when the U.S. set the Iraqis up for an uprising and left them or threw them under the bus, literally. And I was one of the participants in that uprising, as I said, or the 11 years to 12 years of sanctions that depleted Iraq and completely crippled the country and the population. All of these. So the U.S., I think, went with, one could say, if not arrogant, then definitely a misguided set of assumptions that they needed to walk on the ground rather than where they were. And that's another problem. Ultimately, we are where we are right now. And I think I'm always, as much as I assign blame for the United States for the early time, but I think today's Iraq is not just a function of or a result of U.S. blunders and mistakes, but the Iraqis contributed also a lot to that. I think the political leadership that took Iraqi helm for at least over a decade now, they have contributed worse to, you could say the Americans didn't care. It wasn't, but the Iraqis, it's their country, it's their people, it's their families, it's their history. And they treated it absolutely like I saw more care among Americans than among the Iraqi leaders who took positions in Iraq.
It seems to me, based on what Joshua said and what you have said, and what I also have always believed, is that we have a problem of cultural and historical ignorance by U.S. policymakers. Because Joshua a minute ago was talking about how we misread the opposition to Assad. And here you are, as an expert, telling us how we also misread the situation in Iraq, and we were more or less uninformed about the history of modern Iraq, how Iraq was established after World War I, and what the British had done. I'll come back to that in a second. I want to go back to Dr. Slim and focus on Syria, on Lebanon, and what is going on now and what can be done. Your economic description of Lebanon is really sad, but as Joshua said, the situation in Syria is not better, and the situation in Iran is not that much better either. And one of the problems that Lebanon seems to me has, is the problem of Syrian refugees. There are a large number of these people going there, and I honestly feel sorry for the people of Lebanon, because I've been to Lebanon. It's a wonderful, beautiful country. It really is one of the most beautiful countries I've ever been to. Wonderful people. It's a small country, and we have over 1 million Syrian refugees, and now we have all these problems on top of it. So the question, considering the economic collapse of the economy, and considering the sectarian nature of Lebanese politics, Christians against Sunnis, against Shiites and Druze, and all of that sectarian conflict, what can the US do right now? If you have a few moments tonight after the debate with President Trump, and he asks you, what can we do? What can America do to help Lebanon? What would you say?
Well, I mean, we need to do more in terms of support for Lebanon. As you said, it's now in terms of the number of refugees per capita, it has the second highest number of refugees per capita in the world. Second in the world. It has 1.3 approximately million Syrian refugees registered, estimated. So there are 880,000 of them registered with UNHCR. You have about 29,000 Palestinian refugees from Syria registered in Lebanon with UNRWA. You have long-standing 470,000 Palestinian refugees registered with UNRWA. And then you have about 18,000 between Iraqi and other nationalities refugees. This is a small country, as you said, and it's about 5.4, 5.6 million, people. So I can tell you what Mr. Trump and President Trump is interested in and has been interested in. There has not been, and I think Kadhim would say the same thing maybe about Iraq, but there's never been, at least not even under Trump, but even before that, there has not been a Lebanon policy for the United States. Lebanon has always been looked at through other regional lenses that we have. In the case of the Trump administration, it's the Iran lens. It's the maximum pressure strategy lens. And so it has been looked at mostly through Hezbollah, and the way we acted is sanctions on Hezbollah, and allies of Hezbollah and business entities affiliated with Hezbollah. Recently, we have started looking at it through this lens of increasing Israeli rapprochement with the Arab region. Why? Because we have, after many years of shuttle diplomacy by the Americans between Israel and Lebanon, Lebanon has agreed to enter into indirect negotiation with the Israelis on delimitation of their maritime borders. This focus on energy resources in the East Med has not started with Mr. Trump. It started with the Obama administration, but it's of particular interest to Mr. Trump because it's of particular interest to an important base of the Republican Party and of the Trump administration. And we have the security assistance. Recently, in fact, we have had problems because we have members of the Republican Party in Congress who are increasingly questioning the assistance that the United States has been providing to the Lebanese armed forces, which is an important component. So what can we do? We need assistance for food. People are going to go hungry. Winter is coming. You have a blast that you referred to earlier that leveled about a quarter of the city of Beirut. You have 300,000 people homeless because of this blast. As I said, people are going to go hungry because they cannot afford basic services. You have students who cannot go to universities or you cannot go to schools because they cannot pay the fees. And I have to say that USAID has been doing well in terms of repurposing some of the funds towards helping schools, universities, and scholarships. You also have COVID. You haven't talked about the COVID pandemic. It is big in Lebanon right now. I mean, yesterday I was talking with my family in Lebanon, and we have a relative who is sick and who had to go to the hospital. They could not find a bed in one hospital to take that elderly patient, in any hospital in Lebanon, because, most of the beds are occupied by COVID patients, so So there are no ICU beds to be had anymore. So you need more assistance, and the U.S. has been doing that in terms of, providing money for Lebanon in terms of hospitals and all this. But also, we don't know, to be very honest, how much the COVID is spread. We don't know the extent of its spread in the refugee communities. Remember, Syrians in Lebanon, Syrian refugees, are not in camps like in part of Turkey and in Jordan. They are mostly in communities. They rent homes or rooms, and they are in informal settlements. And many of them, even if they have COVID, they are afraid to go to the hospitals, either because they cannot afford the money, they don't have the money, but two, they are afraid that they are going to be kicked out of the community. Because you had some communities in Lebanon, when they heard that this family of refugees had a COVID patient, they kicked them out, of the community. So we don't know the extent of spread. So we need assistance to the refugees, more assistance to deal with these health challenges. But it's not only the refugees, it's the whole country that now needs assistance on so many levels.
Just so that the audience can understand, there are 1.2 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Am I correct?
No, 1.3.
1.3.
Approximately. Remember, we have stopped, the Lebanese government has stopped UNHCR from officially registering refugees in 2015. Okay. So this number is approximate.
All right. And how many Palestinian refugees do we have approximately?
About 470,000.
That is about 1,800,000, just pretty close to 2 million. Let's round it a bit, say 2 million.
And you have 18,000 refugees, Iraqis and other nationalities.
All right. So it comes pretty close then 2 million. So that the people understand what that means. What is the population of Lebanon?
It's about 5. But again, we don't know. It's approximate. We have not had a national census since 1932. Yeah. It's about 5.4, 5.6 million.
So let's say 6 million.
Yes.
So you have, out of 6 million people, you have 2 million refugees in that country. And I'm sorry to say that the international community has not done the job they need to do. And that's why that economy, it's one of the reasons why it is collapsing. I'll come back to you in a second. Okay. Joshua, I have a sort of twofold question for you. 3 perhaps. And I know you can answer it in 5 minutes. Number 1, please tell us what the U.S. is doing in Syria right now, what they're trying to achieve. I'm talking about the President Trump's policy in Syria. And the second question is, do you agree with what the U.S. is doing? If not, what would you propose? And finally, the question that I am most interested in, what are the chances of Assad staying in power for the next 4 or 5 years? Is there an election schedule? Is he going to be there? What is your assessment? So a 3-part question.
Right. Let me begin with question number 3 first. Okay. Assad is likely to remain in power. He's defeated the opposition, which is now in a rump state on Idlib in very sad conditions, and in other places as well. But he has reconquered about 65, 70% of the country. The rest of it is held by the United States with Kurdish, largely Kurdish militias, proxies, or by Turkey with various militias from the opposition. But the larger part and the big cities, Aleppo, Homs, Hama, and Damascus, are all held by Assad. So he's there, and nobody can unseat him. They've tried for 10 years, they've failed. There may be demonstrations, there's going to be low-level terrorism and uprisings and so forth, but though they don't stand a chance of defeating the Syrian army. So I think we have to expect that Assad is going to remain in power for a long time to come, unless some, cataclysm happens. And that's our situation. So what is the United States? What are U.S. objectives? The U.S. has articulated a number of different objectives depending on which time of the year it is. But the legal objective of the State Department is regime transition. And that means that there should be UN-backed elections, and the opposition should take part in government after free elections that would theoretically unseat Assad. And that this was supposed to be a peaceful change of power. And that's why the United States, that's the argument for why the United States is holding a big hunk of Syria, one of the best hunks, which has got most of the good agriculture, most of the oil, and a lot of the water, which is the northeast of Syria, where the Kurds predominate and Arab tribes along the Euphrates River. So the United States is withholding that as leverage. And other times it said it wants Iran out of Syria. It's encouraged Israel to bomb Syria and Iranian interests in Syria. And then thirdly, Jim Jeffries more recently said his job, he's the special envoy to Syria, said that his job was to create a quagmire in Syria in order to hurt Russia and hopefully drive out the Iranians. So those are three different objectives that have been articulated by the administration at different times. Probably all of them are of interest to the US. Can the US achieve any of those with the leverage that it has? I don't believe it can. It's not going to get a UN new constitution. Already we see Assad dragging his feet, and the opposition, the Kurds aren't even included in it, and they're the ones that America supports. The thing is, if it's not stillborn, it's on very slow burner. So we're not going to have regime change, I don't believe. And the Russians are not going to leave. Syria is very important for the Russians. And I think the Russians believe that they have won the war, along with Iran. And Iran is very influential and has become more influential. The weaker Assad becomes, the more Iran is influential. In fact, a number of the Gulf countries are beginning to think, let's reconnect with Assad and try to push Iran out a little bit by ourselves helping. America has stopped that and has warned countries not to engage with Assad, but that's going to be, I think that lays in the future. You know, what does the future hold is that Assad hangs on. This is a black hole in the middle of the most important part of the Mashriq. Every country needs Syria, it needs to cross the country, trade. Lebanon needs it as much as any country. It's the only border that Lebanon can trade with. So all of this is on hold as sanctions are crushing Syria and that very narrow regime and this proxy wars. So Syria is going to remain fragmented. And part of this is to stop what would be a natural economic rebuilding, which is for the first time in modern Middle Eastern history, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran are all ruled, if you will, by regimes that get along with each other. And you could build pipelines from Iran to the Mediterranean, which would be the natural and best way for Iran to get its oil out to Europe, right over the desert rather than through mountains and other places. It also is a natural for tourism, for highways, for all kinds of commerce. But that is stopped. And the Cold War that is being fought between Russia and the United States is extremely detrimental. For example, the United States has militia members, military members in Tanf, right on a desert town on the main highway between Damascus and Baghdad, over which almost all the trade ran. Today, that's all completely stopped because America is trying to starve Syria in order to get this regime change, which it won't get. So I think, in short, to sum up, the United States has objectives which are far beyond its leverage. It has considerable leverage, but not enough to get rid of Assad, not enough to change behavior of the regime in any dramatic way. And until it begins to bargain on much smaller things like getting the ICRC, the Red Cross, into Syrian prisons, you know, working on some human rights issues, those things it could possibly make progress on with Assad, who is desperate for more money. But regime change, I don't believe they can do it. They failed in this long war, and it's not going to happen now. And America's stuck in this situation. It's going to be hard for Biden to get out of the Syria situation.
Joshua, it is really, truly amazing to me how some people are so naive in Washington. They tried almost for 10 years to get rid of Assad. They used every military option they had. What makes them think now that Assad has won the war, he is going to accept a peaceful transition of power? It must have been the other way around. They should have tried the peaceful ways first. If it didn't work, to go to more violent one. We started with a violent attempt to overthrow the regime, and now we're going back to the more peaceful one. Now, Dr. Kadhim, I want to ask almost the identical question I asked Joshua from you. That is, tell us now, what is the U.S. up to in Lebanon? What do they want? Do we know what it is they want? The second part of my question is that, from what I understand, the Iraqis, the Iraqi foreign minister and Iraqi prime minister, both are on record to say that they have good relationship with the United States. It's a strategic relationship, but they also have good, deep historical, cultural, and religious ties to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Tell us how Iraq is managing the Cold War. The US and Iran are fighting in somebody else's land in Iraq. So question number one, US objectives, and question number two, how Iraq is managing the Cold War between the US and Iran.
Well, the U.S. objectives in Iraq are mixed. On the one hand, they want to maintain a good relation with the country. The U.S. invested a lot, and they want to keep Iraq as a country they can do business with. That's kind of the classic objective. But I think the biggest problem is, I go back to what Randa just mentioned earlier, is that the United States has put Iraq's policy as a footnote to Iran's policy. In other words, the maximum pressure policy on Iran can only work if all neighbors comply with this maximum pressure. And Iraq is the lung through which Iran is breathing, and the United States wants to squeeze that lung as much as it can. The U.S. moved from one administration to another, from full engagement under the Bush administration as a legacy of the invasion and occupation, then and state building, and then the Obama administration that fully disengaged, and then at the end, the ISIS crisis basically forced the United States to go back to Iraq and then send some troops. Now, the problem with the Trump administration, Trump wants to leave Iraq and bring the troops out. And that's what he's trying to do elsewhere also. But the problem with it is that after the January 2020 killing of General Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the second person in the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, Iran made it clear that their retaliation would be expelling the last soldier from the U.S. soldier from Iraq. So withdrawal of the troops would be an opportunity for Iran to declare victory and to say that they retaliated. Knowing the nature of the Trump administration and President Trump himself, this is not going to happen. He is not going to allow the Iranians to say we won, even if it's a symbolic victory. So they are keeping these forces and putting them in harm's way. They are forcing the Iraqis to keep a few thousand U.S. soldiers, even though there is a parliamentary vote that asked the government to negotiate their withdrawal, that there are proxies of or fighting forces. Some of them are very close to Iran, in fact, proxies of Iran. Some of them are Iraqi forces that want the U.S. troops to be withdrawn. And that is the current problem, is that the U.S. wants to withdraw, but it doesn't want to withdraw on the terms that they are asked. This is a major problem, and I think what the United States is doing is that there are three major interests of the U.S. in Iraq, and that's where they are missing the big picture. There is the diplomatic interest, and there is the military's relation with the troops in Iraq, and there is the business relation. And I've written on that in the past, and I talked about it in public. I said the business interests of the United States are gone in Iraq right now. No American company can go and open shop in Iraq. The troops are a question of dispute and problem, and between the U.S. wants to keep them at a certain level and the Iraqis want them to be withdrawn. And then the diplomatic relations. My argument all along with U.S. Officials and in public is, look, the business is lost. There is nothing you can do about it right now. The troops are negotiable, and the diplomatic relations are the constant. History tells us, and I'm an Iraqi historian, that every time the U.S. embassy went out of Iraq, it took up to 10 years to bring it back. So keep the diplomatic relations and let the diplomats work with their skill and their patience behind closed doors. They will bring back the business relations. And then the troops, who knows, if Iraq needs them, they will go back. If Iraq doesn't need them, then, we don't need troops in Iraq. But the diplomatic relations should be preserved at all costs. That deaf ear that you hit when you talk to them, basically. Now we are talking about recently, the talk is that the U.S. wants even to close the embassy. I doubt that they will do. But at least this is the talk in Iraq, that the U.S. is going to close the embassy. Now, closing the embassy means there is no relations at all. There are no interests of Iraq. That is really a very lousy way, clumsy way to do foreign policy and bilateral relations. You need to save what you can save if you are in a hard situation. And I think priority should be given to the diplomatic relations. The other problem, and I will conclude with this, is basically the U.S. does not treat Iraq as a counterpart. It always sends dictations and demands to the Iraqi government. And that delegitimizes the Iraqi government and creates problem for them, showing them that they are puppets. And that's a problem. So they need to listen more to the Iraqi government and work with them rather than just pass them demands and orders.
A quick question for you. You talk about closing down American embassy in Baghdad, which is, from what I understand, the largest embassy anywhere in the world. And the U.S. has spent quite a bit of money building it in the green zone. Are there actually American politicians or strategists who propose that? And are they Iraqis who really are pushing for that? Because I agree with you, closing down embassy or breaking up diplomatic relations, just like everything else in life, breaking things is very easy. Rebuilding them is very difficult. Who are these people who propose such unbelievably unproductive proposals?
Well, I think it was, when it was said to the Iraqis, I have two theories, and I don't have the definitive real story here, is that either they wanted to rattle the Iraqi leadership because they know that this leadership needs American backing. So they told them, we are going to close our the embassy, and we are going to, and it was meant to be done off record. And then, with Iraqis, the moment everybody went home, they tweeted that, or they sent it from the car, and it was leaked. That's one scenario. Or the other scenario, basically, it was told to the Iraqis one way, and the Iraqis wanted to rattle their own people to say, look, if we don't do this, but one or another, either Mr. Pompeo or the President Barham Saleh wanted to rattle somebody, and then this ended up coming out. And it is so embarrassing because, look, no matter how you look at it, if the Iranians and the fighting groups in Iraq want the US out, and you tell them, if you keep sending these rockets, we will go out and we will close the embassy. Do you think they will do less or more of these attacks? so if that is meant to stop the attacks, that is some ingenious way to do it. But either way, I think it was just, as I said, a clumsy way of doing foreign policy that could be done better from both sides, both ends, Baghdad and Washington, I think, because it came in Baghdad and it was not denied in Washington. So, here, when you look at it, really, it's, I don't know. I mean, this is just weird. But we live in really interesting times, as the Chinese say.
Very, very well. I think they're going to have time for another quick round of questions because there are some important issues I want to ask you guys. Let me start with Dr. Slim. A twofold question. Number one, what do you think about, if I understand correctly, Mr. Saeed Hariri has expressed his willingness to, again, God knows for how many times, but he has agreed to serve as prime minister. Can he, does he have the political and social backing to really change things? And the second part of my question that is related to the first one, I think it is clear now that Hezbollah is a major player, if not the major player. It's one of the major players in Lebanon. What do you see the future of Hezbollah as Lebanon is trying to get out of this economic and political crisis?
Look, yes, Mr. Hariri today accepted the job.
Oh, he accepted already.
Today, the president today issued a decree basically tasking him to form the cabinet. If we look at past records, this might take up to 6 months, to form the cabinet. However, because of the economic conditions and because there is, the French president, Macron, has been pushing for a cabinet to be formed. Initially it was not by a politician like Mr. Hariri, by somebody else. It failed, and now it is Mr. Hariri. Mr. Hariri today promised that it's going to be, a fast process. I don't know. Maybe there is. Everybody now is feeling the pressure of the economic, of the dire economic straits. Now, would Mr. Hariri be able to stop the precipitous decline? Again, I'm not an economist, but the economists who know Lebanon and to whom I have talked recently, they don't think that all he can do. They think all he can do is stopgap measures, but he's not going to be able to, stop this downward spiral, accelerating downward spiral of accelerating inflation, accelerating devaluation of the pound, and the impoverishment that happens. So the IMF, because the only pathway for Lebanon economy to not recover, but to at least take a breather, is through a package, an IMF package. And IMF now is insisting that Mr. Hariri has to come up with a comprehensive reform package, something that neither he nor his predecessors have been able to, introduce structural reform package in the electricity sector, in many, of the state services. But also, not only has he to come up with a reform package, he has to also fast track it legislatively through the parliament, which has been also very difficult for him in the past and for his predecessors. So, time will tell. I don't think he will be able to reverse to reverse the conditions to a point where we can talk about an economic recovery. He can maybe give, as I said, the economy a breather, but I think we are heading into really, very dark times. In Lebanon, always you have to think also about the security implications of these economic conditions, given the history of the country and given the fact that, there are opportunities now for people to be hired, especially in some communities, to go and fight in proxy wars or even to fight in Lebanon. For example, there has always been this idea of forming a Sunni militia to fight a Shia militia, which is Hezbollah. And until now, this scenario has not materialized, partly because there has not been backers for it, because you need money to form a Sunni militia. And the Gulf countries have been reluctant, to engage in this kind of task. In fact, they have exited Lebanon. The Gulf countries really have exited Lebanon in terms of economic assistance, but also in terms of political interest. And the emotional relationship that the previous royals used to have to Lebanon, with like the late Emir of Kuwait. This is a person who had a personal relationship with Lebanon. He cared about Lebanon because he grew up, he spent part of his summer there. The same thing with the late King Abdullah. This new crop of leadership in the Gulf does not have that same kind of emotional connection to Lebanon. And so for them, from a cost-benefit analysis, they look at Lebanon, it's a lost cause, It's lost to the Iranians, fine. Let the Iranians deal with it. Let the Iranians take care of the economic mess it is in today. And so, I think it in terms of Hezbollah, look, it's not really an important player. It's the player. It is the player which has veto power over almost any decision that gets made in government. And it plays that game, tries to play that game carefully. It has it has an alliance that includes the FPM, the Lebanese president political party, along with Amal, the other Shiite political party, and then also some other Sunni independent politicians. But going forward, I think Hezbollah has taken a long time to understand the gravity of the economic situation. Hezbollah does not do economics well. It doesn't have a good cadre of economic experts. It does fighting. It does resistance. It doesn't do economy. And so it took them a long time to really understand the gravity of the economic situation. I think they are getting there. And how is that going to affect? It has already affected their calculus by the fact that they went against the wishes of their ally, Gibran Bassil, who is the son-in-law of the president. They went against his wishes in accepting the nomination of Hariri, because the relationship between Hariri and Bassil is extremely, is not good. And in the past, Bassil was able to block the nomination of Hariri through Hezbollah to the prime minister job. This time, they went and bypassed that veto or that attitude by Bassil, and went with the nomination of Hariri, partly, I think, because they understand the gravity of the situation. Now, how they're going to manage this, this political game that they have been playing inside Lebanon, it's going to be interesting to watch. But definitely, I think there is no party today in Lebanon that can confront Hezbollah and win that contest.
All right, thank you. Those of you who are watching the program, if you have any questions, please go to your email them to us, go to the chat room and send your question. And right after the next round of questions, I'll read them to our speakers. Joshua, I have a final question for you about this dynamic relationship between Iran, Russia, and Syria, amongst them, inside Syria versus Israel. You talk about how Israel has been bombing or claimed to have been bombing Iranian facilities or Iranian bases in Syria. The Iranians basically say most of this stuff is not true, but from what I understand, it is true. So tell us about the dynamic of this relationship between Syria and Israel, and also Russia and Israel, and Iran and Israel in Syria.
Essentially, there is an alliance between Iran and Russia. They've helped each other preserve their sphere of influence against an America and the Gulf and Israel, who've tried to push them out. And many people prophesize that you can split the Russians from the Iranians, because there is a lot of competition on the ground for money and oil and various interests. And and whatnot. But essentially, I think there is a very strong alliance, despite the ideological differences between the two countries. Because the United States, particularly under Trump, sided with the Sunni Arab world almost uniquely. Now, I know Iraq is a bit of a different thing. It helped the Shiites to power, but then it thought better of it, really, and has gotten fed up with the Shiites because they're allied with Iran. And in order to destroy or to frustrate this, in a sense, Shiite crescent, as King Abdullah of Jordan called it, from Lebanon with Hezbollah right over to Iran, in order to try to break that, the United States has allied itself with the Sunni world, with the Gulf, with Saudi Arabia, with Israel. And therefore, the Russians, who've just recently come back to the Middle East and really are filling a vacuum with the Shiites, particularly in Syria, but with Iran as well, who need help. They can't go to the United States, they can't go to Europe, they have to go to Russia, and increasingly to China, as Iran is doing. And therefore, that alliance is, they're both of their interests and their position in the Middle East that they've carved out in the northern Mashriq is dependent on each other. So I don't think that anybody's going to have any real success in splitting the two, despite their deep differences over a number of issues. And now Russia is quite friendly with Israel and is friendly with a number of other countries. It doesn't have the same animus against Israel that Iran does. And this is really, Iran's dislike of Israel is really baked into its Shiite revolution outlook. And it's going to be very hard to change. How many people have come to me and said, oh, if only Iran would do what it did under the Shah and make friends with Israel and be against, try to enlist Israel against some of its Sunni tormentors, that would make Iran so much stronger. But of course, Iran can't do that. And it has left Iran as this resistance force outside of the mainstream with an alliance of the United States, the Gulf, Israel against it, and Europe. And that has hobbled Iran, and we see it's been beggared through these sanctions. So has Syria. Lebanon has been able to avoid that fate because there's so many Lebanese in America who stopped this. And many of those Lebanese, were cheerleading sanctions on Syria and Iran. But once Washington contemplated putting sanctions on Lebanon because of the strength of Hezbollah, the Lebanese have really rallied, and I think they've been able to stop that movement, which is very important to stop it because sanctions are devastating for the Middle East. And it's going to be very hard to repair the situation in Syria because of these sanctions and because it's allied against the West, which is extremely strong.
Very good. And Dr. Kadhim, the last question for you before I go to the audience. It's somehow related to the question I asked Joshua. We don't hear much about Iraq's relation or lack of it with the state of Israel. Would you tell us a little bit about that relationship, if it exists at all? And secondly, and please try to do that in 4 or 5 minutes so that we can go to the audience. Secondly, tell us a little bit about Saudi Arabia and Iraq and what the Saudis are up to in Iraq today.
Two easy questions, but they can be really interesting when you look at them in a deeper way. Iraq have to have relations with Israel. There is no border. There are no relations. There's no need at all. Israel for Iraq might as well be Mozambique. It's so far, there is no need. So, if I were to put a list for priorities for the Iraqi government, Israel will not make page 82 in the list of priorities. Now, that isn't seen by many people. They think there should be relations. But I think this is a problem that the Iraqi government should not pick right now. We have to remember that Iraq is a country that is one of the main countries that fought Israel and that had relations. In fact, it is the country that has not signed even a truce. They are still legally at war. So they really, it's a legacy that started with the Arab nationalism pre-Ba'ath Arab nationalism. Then the Arab nationalism of the Ba'ath party also gave the same thing for Iraqis ideologically. And these two regimes or movements that led Iraq was followed by the Islamist movement right now that is dictating in issues Iraq, and they are also not interested in relations with Israel. So I don't see any need or even any urgency for Iraq to pick this issue, which is so controversial that it could really muddy the water in Iraq, and no wise Iraqi politician or leader, social, religious, or political, who would say, let us deal with this situation. So the better or the more this relationship or this talk is postponed, the better it is for Iraq. And as I said, Iraq could go for 300 years without even thinking about Israel, and the life in Iraq will go along very well. The Saudi is a different story. Saudi is looking at Iraq as a way, just like the United States. They are not interested in a relation with Iraq for Iraq's sake. They want to have Iraq to be to augment their power or assets in fighting Iran or in their rivalry with Iran. And that is a problem. The Saudis initially acted in a counterintuitive way, just like the Iranians. The Americans changed the regime in Iraq. Iran, that was the enemy of the United States, embraced the change and embraced the government that the U.S. put in Baghdad and sent an ambassador and had good relations with them. And the Saudis, who are U.S. allies, did everything in their power and said it also. I mean, Prince Turki al-Faisal wrote an op-ed in a leading U.S. Newspaper saying we went in Iraq against the U.S. policy. And so they took a good about 11 years doing everything they could to thwart the change in Iraq, from facilitating or starting with the refusing relations with the new Iraqi government, using their media to bombard the Iraqis with negative coverage, and then there is, of course, the well-known support for terrorism. And this is still unsettled, whether it is through private Saudi money or private and government. The line is very blurred in Saudi between private and public money. But clearly, Saudi was a negative influence on Iraq. Then they discovered that they did not win, just like in Syria. So they thought, okay, let's go back and embrace Iraq. And they forgot that the Iranians had 11-year head start with creating facts on the ground. Their relations with the Iraqis were going well, and then now they are complaining that the Iraqis are not on good terms. Now Iraq is, in a way, is accepting their relation with Saudi, but they want it on different terms than the Saudis. They want Iraqi-Saudi relations for their own sake, because Iraq is done fighting wars on behalf of others. The Iraq of Saddam Hussein that fought the Iraq-Iran war on behalf of the Gulf states is no longer there. And the Saudis and other Gulf states need to understand and accept this reality and embrace Iraq for what it is. Saudis do a lot of talk, but when it comes to action, they are unpredictable. I mean, if the Iraqis understand, see the situation, if Qatar, which is a GCC member, when they were talking about unity of these 6 states, and then overnight, even the camels, Qatari camels that were in Saudi, were not allowed to be given water and food, and they died in the desert. In that callous kind of way, do they think that the Saudis are predictable partner of Iraq in 5 months from now, much less 5 years or 5 decades? So the Saudis have a lot of work to do to change their own politics and their own political philosophy from that of the tribe to that of the state. And once that happens, see, Iran, you can say all you want about it, but Iran is a state. And, they are clear when they act against the interests of Iraq or for the interests of Iraq, they are acting like a state. The Saudis are acting on the whim of one person who one day wants the relations and the other day he wants blood, and that's a problem. So I think and Iraqis have to deal with it. Saudi is a neighbor. Saudi has a border with Iraq. Saudi is at the end of the day, it has its own weight, but unfortunately, it has missed the opportunity to earn its position that can be there for Saudi in the region.
Thank you. And now we are finished with the first part of our conversation, and now I have received a number of questions from the audience, and I will try to have one question for each one of you, and I'm going to read it, and I'm going to start with the first question I received. I think it is for Joshua. It says, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being completely wrong, to 10 being I always get everything right, how do you rate the accuracy of your predictions about Syria from 2011? Before you answer it, I'm going to answer it for you because I have followed you. Your predictions have been infinitely superior to the prediction of most experts. But go ahead and answer the question. How do you rate your own predictions about Syria in the past 10 years?
You know, we've all made a lot of mistakes along the way. You know, who could have Syria would get just as bad as it got? Very hard to predict that. On the other hand, you know, in 2005, I lived in Syria for a year, and I wrote an article in which I predicted that if a number of friends of mine in Washington wanted to topple the regime already in 2005 because Assad was toying in Iraq, was hurting America in a number of places. And I said, you know, if you do that, there's going to be a Zarqawi who's going to rise up in Syria because Syria doesn't have a very strong middle class. It's very fragmented. The people haven't come to an agreement on what kind of government do they want. You know, there are many Islamists. There are many people who want a Western type democracy, but there isn't a unified, you know, the business people who are extremely conservative. There are civil rights leaders, but then there's all the sectarian differences. There's the regional differences. It would be very difficult, I thought, to get a middle class that would want democracy. And I said, the chances are there's going to be a Zarqawi type thing. And it's going to be very hard to overturn this regime because it'll fight like the Dickens, because the Alawites have in a sense a minority complex, and they believe that what happened to them, what happened to the Armenians or that happened to many of the minorities in Iraq could happen to them if they lost power. And so they will fight viciously. And that's, you know, I was a lonely voice in Washington in 2011, warning that it wouldn't be 3 months or 6 months, as most people thought Assad would just go down the drain and he didn't have any public support. But he had more public support than people understood, even though there were many people who wanted change. Everybody in Syria wanted change. But once it came to shooting, just as in Lebanon or in Iraq, once the people from one group see that the others want to get rid of their leaders, they start backing their leaders, no matter how corrupt they are. And that's been the problem of Syria. And I think, having lived there for many years, being married to a Syrian and having studied it, I could see those problems. And I lived in Lebanon for a big period of the civil war and watched the same complications in Lebanon, the inability of the leaders, who are all smart on their own, to put the nation ahead of their own group. And that has really hobbled countries, all three of our countries that we're talking about. And that is still the big challenge for the future.
Dr. Kadhim, two quick questions, and then there is a question for Dr. Slim. Dr. Kadhim, do you think that the threat of shutting down the embassy in Iraq, even if it was just a bluff, actually worked? And the second question from someone else is, Ayatollah I can't read it. I think Ayatollah, I can't read it, has indicated that given a decree that Iraqi Shiites cannot deal with the state of Israel. Is that true? I think he means Ayatollah Sistani. So first question, has the bluff of shutting down the embassy worked? I think you answered this, but please do it again. And the second one, has Ayatollah Sistani actually issued a decree, a fatwa, forbidding Shiites from dealing with state of Israel, with Israeli businessmen?
Good two questions. The shutting of the down of the embassy, I don't see it happening. We can see decrease of diplomats, number of diplomats. We could see maybe transfer to another safer location, but I don't believe that the U.S. is going to close that embassy. It did produce a truce between the fighting groups that were attacking U.S. interests, and mostly Iraqi contractors who supply U.S. Personnel with logistics. But also we've seen some other attacks that happened, and the truce is just a truce. It's a time to give the government to withdraw some of the troops from the U.S. troops from Iraq. So I don't think that this is an issue that needs to be addressed in a better way. I think the United States needs to move from dealing with the government to taking into consideration that the Iraqi government is only one voice and one decision maker in Iraq, not the decision maker. And other people they have to also be listened to, social and political leaders, even in the region, not just in Iraq. But the Israel situation, yes, Grand Ayatollah Sistani was asked about the products that are Israeli products that are manufactured in settlements, I believe. That was the question recently that came, because there are some of them apparently went to certain part of Iraq, and he was asked. And, you know, there are some people who are interesting. They sent fatwas that any person by their intuition, they should understand the answer. But Sistani, just like, I mean, he is not really telling the Iraqi government to have relations or not to have relations. Iraq's position with Israel is clear. Iraq has already said that they are adhering to the Arab Initiative. In other words, Israel allows the Palestinians to have a state of their own, a viable state, true state. Israel withdraws from the, according to all of the international law, the UN resolutions, comply by them. And Israel acts like a real state, not as an occupation. And then basically the Arab Initiative says they will have normal relations with all Arab states. All what they have right now, they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to continue taking the lands. They want to continue to ignore UN resolutions. They want to continue to deny the Palestinians their rights, and they want normalization with Arabs. So what do? They go for a nothing burger, like having normal relations with Bahrain, because, you know, Bahrain is not Iraq, and Iraq is not Bahrain. The prime minister of Iraq is an elected official in a country that has all kinds of forces. Most of them are more powerful than him. The Bahraini king, he can sign anything he wants, and if a Bahraini citizen says why, he will take his citizenship away and chop his head. That's not available in Iraq. So you can never have relations with Israel in Iraq the same way you do it with countries that are not accountable, not elected, that care not about their people. And also their relations are not as relevant, as important. You can have it with the UAE. You can, in fact, have it with all 22 Arab countries. It will still make no sense and mean nothing unless you have normal relations with the Palestinians. Other Arab countries are just, you know, basically nosy other people who are putting their nose in the Palestinian issue for so long that they spoiled it for the Palestinians and they did not do anything good for themselves. So, you know, what is being done in the region is really a plaything rather than real peace, where you can find real comprehensive peace and you have people having a better region.
Thank you. I started our conversation with the question from Dr. Slim, and I'm going to end it with a question for you, and that is, what is the nature of Russia's relations with Lebanon? Do they have a relationship? And if they do, what do they want from Lebanon?
Look, I mean, they have been trying now to get the Lebanese to purchase Russian weapons. And the Lebanese army has, and there have been many offers made by Moscow to Lebanon. And the Lebanese army and the Lebanese government have basically stayed away from the offer. I think Russia looks at its interest in Lebanon the way, as Josh said, is trying to fill a vacuum, which has been vacated on one hand which has been created on one hand by the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, exiting Lebanon. After all, under King Abdullah, there was an offer of a military assistance package to the Lebanese army in the amount of $3 billion. And that was rescinded by this king and by the crown prince. And so there is a vacuum, and as I said, created by the exit of GCC countries from Lebanon. But there is also, a vacuum that is the whole region is feeling, is by looking at the disinterest of the United States, increasing disinterest of the United States from, the Middle East problems. I mean, after all, if you look at the Democratic National Committee electoral platform, the Middle East is the last item in a 70-plus page document. And I think there is this feeling in the whole region that the United States is not as interested and is not going to be as involved going forward in the region. And so Russia is trying to build on that, and Lebanon is one of the countries. So do they have now presence? No, they don't. I mean, they have, of course, the embassy and all this, but they don't have the kind of networks in the country. They don't have the kind of public support in the country, especially among the youth, which are very much pro-Western. They don't have the academic, universities in Lebanon. They don't have schools. They don't have the American university, like the American. They don't have Russian university. Lebanese students do not go often to Russia to study, like they come here or they go to France. So they lack this kind of people-to-people networks, and they lack this the business networks, which, for example, the GCC has with Lebanon, which Egypt even has with Lebanon, and so they have excellent relationship with Hezbollah. Every time there is a Russian official, Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, meets with him every time a senior official comes. So they are building this relationship through Hezbollah. But the rest of Lebanon, I think they have not been able to build that kind of strong relationship that the United States still has, especially at the people level, but also other countries had, like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, because of the history of the relationship between Lebanon and between the GCC. And as I said, the number of Lebanese who work in these countries.
Fantastic. Before I say goodbye to you, let me just make a few announcements. Number one, I really want to express my appreciation to three individuals who are behind the scene, who made this program possible. Arman Mohammadi, who's the man who is behind the technical aspect of this. He's a technical wizard. Arman Mahmoudian, who is, again, managing a lot of things behind the scene, and Mr. Brian Tompkins for supervising this operations. The video of this conversation is going to be available on YouTube. You can also see it, watch it from our own website, CSDS at the University of South Florida. And please don't forget to send us your email in your chat box now, so that we can include you for our next program on Monday, November 16th, 7 p.m. With Admiral Stavridis. We are going to talk about American foreign policy challenges under the new administration, either the new Trump administration or Mr. Joe Biden's administration. So with this, Dr. Slim, Dr. Kadhim, and my good friend Joshua, thank you all for participating in this. I learned a great deal from you, and I'm pretty sure our audience also learned from you. Now go ahead and watch television, watch the debate, and I stay safe. And until November 16, good night to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen.
Thank you, Dr. Milani.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Dr.
thank you
Milani.
both.
Thank you.